welcome back. So today we're gonna have another instructional video, and I hope this goes over well. You'll have to bear with me. But today we're gonna talk about canning safety. So this little thing right here has gotten very popular over this past year. Anyone who has tried canning and tried finding jars and lids or purchasing other canning equipment knows that this past year has seen a boom in people gardening and canning their own food, which is fantastic. But at the same time, the supply has not been able to keep up with the demand. Thankfully, I have plenty of these, but with so many new people coming into this whole canning thing, and it's brand new to them, there are some very common misconceptions and safety practices that can sometimes go unheeded. And I wanted to do a video today to kind of go over the importance of canning safety. Now, I am not an expert in canning or canning safety by any means, but I do have some experience in it. I have been canning for a while, and I have learned and studied a lot over this past, especially this past year, but before that as well, on the safety measures that you want to take while canning and why they are so important. So to get started, we're going to talk about like the art and the science of canning. When it comes to cooking, I am very much of an artist in cooking. Now, I know that like professional cooks and bakers might disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine because I'm not an expert cook either. But I see cooking as an art. To me, I rarely follow recipes. You'll almost never see me like following a recipe completely. I'm always substituting things, adding in my own ideas and my own ingredients, and most of the time it does turn out just fine. I definitely have had some flops along the way, but I see cooking as an art. Canning, though, is definitely a science. It's not something that you want to do a whole lot of experimenting on your own with. There is some room for experimenting with canning, but for the most part, it is very much of a science that you want to be able to follow the instructions of approved recipes, how they're stated. Now, this was hard for me to accept, and as of maybe 3, 4, even 5 years ago, I would have kind of laughed at it. I was like, oh, that's just taking it a little bit overboard to have to follow everything just perfectly. But I have since learned that there are reasons behind, very good health reasons behind why you'd want to follow the instructions. Now, I grew up canning. My mom would can salsa, and we would can like jams, and let's see what else. Lots of different kinds of tomato products. We would do like diced tomatoes and sauces. And then also, I would also help out with my grandma. She would can green beans. I wasn't a whole lot involved in the actual canning process when we do that. Usually I was just the green bean snapper. But canning is definitely not a new concept to me at all. And I started canning on my own maybe 4 or 5 years ago, like all by myself. And probably definitely 5 years ago. And very much enjoyed it. I think that the first thing I did like on my own was either salsa or jam. I think it was peach jam that I did. And I have it's sort of a family salsa recipe. It was one that my mom had kind of come up with and modified, and then I took it, and I'm sure I probably modified it some more. And so the first time I canned salsa, like, it was my own recipe. I did follow the instructions of like how long to keep it in the water bath canner, but I did not follow an actual approved recipe. It was just a family recipe, and so many people have made that mistake too. Now, before I go any further in this, before I start like bashing people's great-grandma's recipes. I want to go a little bit deeper, get kind of sciencey, and we're going to talk about the reasons why you don't just want to make up a canning recipe and then stick it in your pantry once you're done. Alright, so I have the pH scale here, and we have number 1, which is going to be more acidic. All the way down here I have number 8, which is going to be more alkaline. Alright, so in order to understand how certain foods need to be processed, we need to be able to look at the pH scale here. So foods like most fruits, apples, berries, peaches, plums, citrus, things like that, are very acidic. They're down here at like the number 1 and 2s. These types of foods are fine to be water bathed canned. So you do not have to use a pressure canner for them. They can just be canned using a water bath. And the reason why is because the bacteria that are going to be in these, present in these higher acidic foods are going to be able to be killed at a lower temperature. They can be killed at just your normal boiling point. Now, as you get further along, you get here to these more neutral numbers, like number 4.5 to 5 is going to be tomatoes. So tomatoes, you can water bath can them, but you need to add something acidic to them. And typically it is going to be like a lemon juice, or even a vinegar. Like if you're making a salsa, then you would add, usually you're going to add vinegar to it. And that is going to allow it to still be water bath canned, but it has the acidicness, yeah, that it needs. Now, as you get further on, most other vegetables are going to come over to these numbers, 6 and above. So your corn, beans, carrots, peppers, etc. These foods are more alkaline. They are going to need a much higher temperature in order to kill the bacteria that can be present on them. These are the ones you're going to be using a pressure canner for. So a pressure canner, how it works is it has a little bit of water in the bottom, and then you basically, you're boiling the water, but it's building up pressure inside that canner, and it's allowing the temperature of the water and of the air inside of it to become much, much hotter than your typical boiling point. And so it is able to kill some of those bacteria that is much harder to destroy, or that won't be destroyed in just your boiling point. So it's important to understand what type of foods can be water bath canned, and then what type of foods need to have a pressure canner. Now, let's say you have green beans and you're wanting to can them. Well, you do not want to use a water bath canner because the temperature inside of it is not going to get hot enough in order to kill those bacteria that would be present there. At the same time, you can pressure can things that are on the more acidic scale. I've done that before, but it's not necessary to do that. A lot of people start out with just water bath canning because it's a little bit simpler and a little bit less intimidating to them. I definitely had spent a lot more time using a water bath canner. But I want to say that using a pressure canner is not really as scary as it sounds. And it can be a lot of fun to learn, and your possibilities of the things that you can are so much greater with that. Alright, so you have your pH scale with your acidic, neutral, and alkaline foods. And then the pressure canner versus a water bath canner. Those things are just important to know. Grab a canning book if you're not sure what foods you have something you're like, I don't know if I can water bath this or if I need to pressure can it. Simple to look up. You can Google it if you want to, but you want to make sure that you are following those instructions correctly. So another thing is it's not just about getting a sealed lid. Canner people enjoy that sound of hearing their jar lid pop whenever they've taken them out of that hot water. It is a good sign. It's a sign that the jar is completely sealed and is airtight. That's fantastic, and that's something that you want every single one of your jars to be able to seal like that, because if it doesn't, then the food inside is going to get air and it's going to mold. But having a sealed jar is not everything. I have seen videos, instructions online that are very, very dangerous, because people will take a hot liquid, the hot food, whatever it is they're putting in here, put it in, and then put a lid on, and then the screw top, and as long as they hear the popping sound, then they are convinced that this food is safe to go on their shelves. And I've seen it multiple times, so it's not just once that some random person tried this. So that's extremely dangerous, because obviously just because no more air can get inside doesn't mean that the bacteria and the pathogens and the mold, everything that is already present in the food, it's still there. And so it can make you very, very, very sick. So while having a sealed lid is fantastic and something that we want for every single one of our jars, it's not the only thing. It's not the most important thing. So we want to kill that bacteria by making sure it's processed in the hot water properly, and then when we take it out, we want to make sure that all of the jars get sealed. The next thing is kind of going back to my story about the salsa, but it is very important that you follow an approved recipe when it comes to canning, and approved instructions. You don't just want to use a recipe that you made up, or a recipe that maybe you've been following for years. Maybe your grandma or your great grandma has used this recipe for years, and it's very sentimental and it's enjoyable and fun to be able to use those when it comes to cooking or baking. But when it comes to canning, you are going to want to find a recipe that has been lab tested. And the reason behind that is, let's say, like my salsa recipe, there are certain ratios of the vegetables that you're putting in, the peppers, the tomatoes, the onions. There's a certain ratio that you have of those things to the acid that you'll be adding to it, which will be like the lemon juice or the vinegars. And there's a certain ratio that you need to have. And if that ratio is off, it can cause unsafe food product later on that can either mold or cause bacteria to grow inside of them while they're sitting on your shelf. And they can be very dangerous for you to consume. Now, that can be hard to hear, because you're like, oh, this family recipe, we've had it for years. So a way around that would be to take that recipe and find something very similar in a approved canning book, cookbook, something like that. And there are a few things in canning that you can tweak, and it's not going to cause problems. A lot of things, like with the salsa, is I have still tweaked the types of seasonings that I've added into it. You know, if you're adding cumin or oregano, like a cayenne pepper, like a powdered cayenne pepper, those sort of things, you can kind of tweak the amount that you're putting in. But your actual vegetables, you don't want to play around with the ratios of those. You want to be able to use a recipe that has been tested, so that you know that the correct processing time that they need to be in there. Does it need to be processed for 10 minutes, or does it need to be processed for 30 minutes? If it's a pressure canner recipe, then what pounds of pressure and for how long are you going to need to be processing this? And so, because really, honestly, you don't want to put all that work into that food, and then it not be safe to consume, or it ends up getting moldy, or worst case scenario, you end up in the hospital because you ate something that was not processed correctly. So, where do you find approved recipes? Well, there's a few different ways that you can. One is there are multiple books out there. So this is the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. This is the only big book that I have. I would like to get another one soon. There's more out there. But this one is it has all approved recipes that have been tested to be safe, to be processed the correct amount of time, ratios, all that sort of stuff. So there are other ones out there. I will try and look a few of those up and link them in the description area below. Another way is I used this a lot last year, but this is just the book that came with my pressure canner. And it has some very basic, simple recipes and instructions in it. So, if you're going to buy a pressure canner or a water bath canner, it probably will come with some sort of instruction book. And this one happens to have some recipes in it as well. The other place that you can go is you can go online to different state universities. They're going to have canning safety information on there, and sometimes you can find recipes as well from them. The other place that I like to go to, and I actually used it a lot last year, that was online is a website called healthycanning.com. And it was a wealth of information. It had questions that people had asked and had answers to go along with them. Questions that you might ask, and because I had questions like, well, what about this, or what can I do this? And I was able to search it and look it up, and obviously they didn't have answers for everything, but it was very helpful. They also have lots of recipes on there as well, and it was just a very down-to-earth, kind of easy to navigate website. So that's healthycanning.com. I'll also link it. So the things that you want to stay away from are going to be just your little homemade recipe books that maybe you might find at an Amish store, or so-and-so's church put it together. They're fun, they're sentimental, and maybe they have been passed down for years. But to be on the safe side, you really probably don't want to use those recipes. Instead, look up approved ones. There's plenty out there that have been tested that can be very similar to those. And then, of course, don't use ones that you've just made up yourself as well. Real quick at the end here, I'm going to talk about what are the dangers of not canning properly. So, so-and-so said that this has to be tested, and, but why? Why do I have to follow an approved recipe? And why do I have to make sure that things are processed the correct amount of time and at the right temperature? Why? So here are a few of the dangers of not following the rules. Don't be a rule breaker in this area. Number one is kind of obvious, but it's mold spoiled canned goods. One time last year, I went to my pantry and pulled out a jar of green beans, and there was this nasty white mold that was gross on top of it. So the lid had not sealed properly, and it probably came unsealed after it got put in the pantry. But anytime you have an unsealed jar that did not get sealed properly, then obviously mold is going to grow in that, and you don't want that to happen. You don't want all that hard work to go to waste because you did not process it correctly and it caused it to mold. And there's multiple reasons why it can mold, or why a jar might not seal properly. Sometimes if you did not wipe the rim of the jars all the way, then that little particles of food can get stuck between the top of the jar and the sealing rubber on the inside and cause it to not seal properly. Sometimes mold will grow because you did not process it at the right temperature for the right amount of time. and the bacteria inside of there was able to keep growing, and it became unsealed because of the pressure, the gases that were inside of it. Those are just some different reasons why, and sometimes you can follow a recipe correctly and you still get mold, but you want to minimize that risk as much as possible. All right, the next thing is number 2 is the danger is the jar not being properly sealed. I kind of already talked about that, but there is, some people say you can reuse lids. You're not really supposed to reuse lids, but mainly the main danger with that is they're considered one-time use because they have a little rubber seal on the inside and they're meant to seal one time. And if you reuse lids, then you're chancing that seal to not be correct. And then that last one that I have written down in number 3 is the risk of botulism. So botulism is something I didn't really know that much about until more recently, in the last year or 2. And I have learned a lot more about it. And it has definitely made an impact in my understanding about canning safely and to want to continue to can safely. So botulism is a toxin that actually lives in the ground. And so everyone is exposed to botulism to some extent. If you are, gardening, if your kids are playing outside, they're going to come into contact with it. But the amounts are tiny. And so it's enough that your body isn't going to probably react adversely to it and become sick. Your body is able to fight off that toxin. But when botulism is in food and we ingest it, then it can cause some very, very dangerous things to happen. The toxin of botulism can easily hospitalize you and even kill you. So, how botulism grows in food is, let's say you have a jar of green beans and you did not process those green beans at, obviously it has to be pressure canned, but you did not follow all the instructions as fly and did not process them at the right amount of time or the right amount of pounds of pressure for the temperature to be able to be a certain amount. And that jar is sitting on your shelf. And it may be sealed. It may be completely sealed. There may not be any mold in it. And visibly, it looks just fine. But inside, those little fingers of that toxin is growing and continues to grow. That's the danger of botulism, is you can't see it, you can't smell it, and you can't taste it. So, if you open up a jar and it smells funny, well, you're not going to use it. You're going to throw it out. If you see mold in it, you're not going to use it. You're going to throw it out. If you take a tiny little taste and you're like, ooh, that's nasty, you're going to throw it out. Well, botulism is very hard to detect because it doesn't have any of those things. And it's an invisible enemy. And so you could process something wrong, not following the instructions, and then feed this to your family, and people get sick, and people can easily become hospitalized, or even die, especially, those, depending on how much they ate, and, no one wants to take that risk with their children or their family, their loved ones. There is a story I heard recently, I don't know when it happened, but I heard it recently, of a lady who had miscanned something and had eaten it. And the first couple times that she ate it, nothing happened. They were fine, but she ate another jar and ended up in the hospital and got to the point where she got so sick on it, she had to be retrained how to eat food and take care of herself because it had such adverse effects on her body. and she almost died from it. And so I know that that is something that can be kind of scary, and it actually does keep, I'm sure it keeps people from wanting to try to can, like, oh my goodness, I don't want to like accidentally hurt my family. I've definitely had those thoughts before. But as long as you're following the instructions, then you shouldn't have, and you're using common sense, you shouldn't have issues with that. So I have one story real quick as I'm finishing up of a big boo-boo that I made. And this might be something that you've done before and you're like, I've never had a problem with it. And I agree, I'd never had a problem with this before, canning this certain way. But I did not follow the instructions, and I regret it. So we had a ton of tomatoes that I was canning over the summer, and most of the time you're going to see recipes, they're going to tell you to take the skins off the tomatoes. And I had seen plenty of recipes out there too, not approved recipes, but other just home canning blogs where they were like, oh, just leave the skins on, it's not that big of a deal, as long as you don't mind the texture of them, and I didn't, then it just saves time. And so I had done that, and that's actually the way that I had grown up doing it as well. We just left the skins on. It wasn't a big deal. And so I canned up, I don't know how many jars of tomatoes, and come to find out, like, it was towards the end of the summer, and so I'd already canned all of these tomatoes up, and I learned that it's a more recent discovery, I guess, but a more recent recommendation that they say don't leave the skins on your tomatoes, because the skins of tomatoes, that's where harbors the most like bacteria and funguses and molds. So you want to take those off so that you're minimizing the amount of bacteria that you're putting in the jar in the first place. That made sense to me. Okay, cool. So I didn't do that. And I was like, well, maybe it's not that big of a deal. And I started digging and started learning more and realized that because I followed all the instructions of the tomatoes, I just left the skins on. And the danger here is no one has ever tested, like in a lab, in a canning lab, what the temperature or the amount of time needs to be in order to process tomatoes with skins properly to ensure that that bacteria in there is nil. They've only tested it with tomatoes that did not have the skins on them. So you're introducing all this bacteria into this jar, and you're processing it according to how you think it needs to be, how you would if it didn't have skins on it. But to leave the skins on and follow the instructions, you're running that risk of the bacteria there not actually being killed properly, and thus the concern of botulism growing inside of it. And so it is not a safe practice. So I actually had gone over this in my head for months and months and months because I did not want to throw out all of those tomatoes. And I had only made a little bit of salsa with them, but I had made some. And I couldn't bear the thought of opening up all those jars and dumping them out. But I finally came to the conclusion that my family's health and my children and my husband and myself, our well-being is more important than the time and effort and even money that was put into canning all of those tomatoes. And it is a mistake that I wasn't willing to admit when I did it, but I'm willing to admit now and realize that I made a mistake, and that I'll be more careful and in the future with doing that next time. That is the end of my little spiel on canning safety. There's a lot more in-depth things that I don't even know yet. But the things I did know, I wanted to make sure that I was able to pass them on to the people that I care about, people who may be watching this video, people who may be like, hey, I'm gonna can this summer for the first time. I want to make sure that you have the tools, at least the beginning tools, that you need in order to have fun canning, because it's a lot of fun, it's enjoyable, it's very rewarding, but also be able to do it safely for yourself and your families. So I hope you all enjoy this video, learned a little bit, and I'll see you guys later.
Thanks for watching. Please be sure to hit that thumbs up if you liked our video, subscribe, and share to anyone else you think might enjoy it. Also, be sure to check out our Patreon page for other ways that you might be able to help support our family. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.